them to sit with your family, make sure that you find out their name, that you use their name. We're on page 80, by the way. So make sure that you use that person's name. We talked about how valuable a name is, how your name distinguishes you from anyone else. And so when we actually speak other people's names, we are doing a really good, really big thing. There are people that don't use people's names, right? We all know those people that are like, hey, you, and they never bother to learn anybody's name in the building. I mean, you can think of those kind of bosses maybe that are sometimes like that, and just different people. So using people's names matters. So if we meet a visitor and we can greet them the next time we see them by the same name that they gave us, then that's a really big thing. The second option was to sit in a new place each week for Bible study and worship. That way, you get to know people in a different place. So we talked about that, and we talked about how in some places that works, or for some people that works, but for others it doesn't. You may have different things kind of tying you to the pew where you usually sit, and that's okay too. And that's why I think she gave us many options. That way, if this just isn't a good fit for you, you just skip that one and choose one of the other ones. One of the options that she gave us was to find a member of our congregation who does not attend fellowship events and ask that person to sit with you at a fellowship event coming up. Just kind of asking them by name and just, you've never come to the ladies' breakfast before, and our snowman exchange is always so fun. Would you like to come? There's plenty of room at our table, that sort of thing. Then the fourth option was if you yourself never go to fellowship events because you don't feel very secure there, you feel anxious in a crowd, that you make a point to go to the fellowship event that you don't usually attend, and maybe you make a point to make plans to sit with somebody that's there that you're already friendly with in the congregation. The last option was pray for somebody who's been missing, somebody that hasn't been able to attend lately, and call and tell that person, hey, we've missed you lately, and that's it. So every one of these options were one that someone could do. There's not any one of us in here that couldn't do at least one of these, even if some of them are not quite as in our comfort zone or in our ability. So then she has 1, 2, 3 pages worth of questions. After you've done this thing, then you're supposed to ask yourself a whole lot of questions. And I felt like these questions were so good, they could be applied all over the place for all sorts of things. And we started talking about these. This is where we had left off last week. So we said, do we, when we're considering these things, do we allow this assignment to motivate us to remove a barrier? So if we are doing the one where we're going to greet a visitor, I mean, if you've come and you've never ever tried to speak to somebody that's visiting, then there's a whole thing that you have to go through to be able to do that, right? And so if you haven't ever done it, then you've got to kind of tear down some walls. You've got to make yourself steeled up and ready to go do that thing that you're not used to doing. And she said, so have we let it motivate us to remove a barrier? What if we choose the one, I don't ever go to fellowship gatherings, right? That's the one you choose, not me. I mean, obviously I do. But if that was your answer and you said, I don't ever go, well, then you have to take down that barrier because you have to be able to walk into the fellowship event. And there's all kinds of reasons why people can't and don't feel comfortable doing it. And the more crowded the event, then the harder that gets for some people. So that might be something. But she's like, what's the motivation, right? What motivates us to do it? And so if we're letting ourselves be motivated by this idea of connecting to someone else, then we can do it a little bit easier, even if it's not in our comfort zone. And she said, what about this? I have decided this day to stop passing people by with just a nod and just a hello. In our country, it is the norm. How are you? Fine. Oh, good. Me too. And then everybody goes about their business. And in the meantime, really, a lot of times, neither of you are fine. And so you've just exchanged niceties that are socially conforming, but you haven't actually had a connection at all. And so it is possible that sometimes maybe our answer needs to be a little different. And one thing that's so special about a group like this is our answer can be different, right? We were just talking about different things going on in our lives or with different people. And so we don't just have to walk in and say, oh, fine, everything's fine. But that is what is expected most of the time. I mean, culturally, people want you to say fine and then to go on. But we aren't cultural, right? We are in the church. And so with our Christian family, we don't have to say fine if everything isn't fine. We can say, you know, if somebody is struggling with pain or they're struggling with a family situation or whatever it is, we have the ability to turn around to our brother or our sister and say so with an honest answer. And she said, you know, your choice, you might be comfortable doing any of these things. Some people are very extroverted, they're very outgoing, they're very energetic, and every single one of those is things they do all the time anyway. And they don't have a single problem with any of it. So you have to decide for yourself which one of those areas that you fall in, which one of those things is easy for you. So she said, really think about these options. If you picked to do one, think about why you picked that one. Why did you not pick another one? Did you not pick it because it was too hard for you to do? Did you not pick it because it was painful for you to do? And for some of these, I mean, I definitely felt like looking at some of these, like, I don't want to do that one. So I'm sure that other people did as well. Because of whatever that you have. If you are a person that has real anxiety, then some of those are going to be hard for you. And so that's a fine answer to have. But then you think about, which one can I do? I can do this one. So she says, what were you thinking about as you prepared to do this assignment? Now, before we start kind of going through these questions, did anybody actually do one of the things, like upstairs in the auditorium? Did anybody think of these and try to actually do one of them? Yeah?
I tried to get Jay to move to a different spot.
Oh,
He
yeah?
didn't want to.
She said that she tried to go and sit in a different spot, but her husband didn't really want to move from his spot,
The
and that's
extrovert
okay.
didn't want
But the thing is, here, if you did, somebody think you was mad, they were mad at us. Yeah.
Well, I did talk to someone that don't come to our get-togethers all the time, Sarah.
Mhm.
You know, tried to encourage her to come to our ladies' breakfast.
Okay.
She still didn't commit, but she
Yeah.
said maybe.
Yeah. Yeah, so we have another that did invite somebody to the upcoming ladies' breakfast that doesn't usually stay and attend the fellowship things. And so we've got people that did.
I've invited Barbara, but she can't, she gets groceries on Thursday.
Okay.
Somebody takes her, she can't.
Uh-huh, right.
But it's somebody here that if you speak to, so I made Sunday, I made that person talk.
So she said that she did speak to somebody that doesn't usually talk a lot, and she also did put out an invite to this ladies class that we have. So we did some of these things. So as you did them, was anybody thinking about, she said you could be afraid of rejection. What happens if that person tells you no? Because sometimes it could be a little bit awkward depending on how the no is said. Because they might just say, oh no thanks, or maybe, but they might actually say something else. And so you've got to kind of be ready to hear their reply and respond to it. And she said, were you afraid that you would lack patience? Patience is not a very American standard a lot of the time. People here aren't very good at being patient much of the time. And so can that be an issue, right? Our patience or our impatience is going to dictate how we respond to people. And a lot of times, if we slow down a little bit, then we might find that we have a little bit more patience.
I hope you have time to hear this.
Yeah.
Our son, they were brought up in a Baptist church. So we're trying to get him to go to he lives close to Charlotte, but he lives in South Carolina, close to Rock Hill. Mm-hmm. But he went to a Church of Christ in Charlotte, big. Mm-hmm. Policeman was there to direct traffic. He went in, nobody spoke to him, nobody said a word. The policeman stood behind him. Mm-hmm. Think he went back? No.
Yeah. Yeah, it's hard a lot of times at big congregations because it's very hard to know who is visiting and who is not. When we were at MSOP, the congregation that oversees the school there has 300 people or so on a regular Sunday morning, and we didn't worship there because Jonathan was working with another congregation, but we were involved over there with enough things. And it can be hard for them to realize who the students are. It can be hard for them to realize who is even visiting and who doesn't already have friends. So some people will go out of their way to just speak to everybody, which is a good way to do it. But other people, I think, sometimes think, oh, they are here and they are in that class with those friends and people are speaking to them. Because people are busy and they're thinking, you know, I got to go to the bathroom in between the service. I got to get my stuff. I got to sit down. Do I have my offering ready? All those things that people think about in between. So I think that one rule of thumb that I've heard before, and I do think it's a good one, is that usually, unless you saw something blatantly unscriptural, it's a good idea to give something a couple or 3 visits to make sure, because it might be that you got missed on the first one, but really it is a friendly congregation. If you were back again, you know, that it could be a different story. So that's something that we've heard from people who are at larger congregations. And some larger congregations answer that by having the period during the announcements where they're like, turn around and speak to the people around you, shake a hand of somebody nearby. I mean, I guess they don't do that with COVID, but we've visited before where that's a thing that they do. And it helps them. I know at the Myrtle Beach congregation, they have so many visitors because that's the only place to worship really if you're there. And so all of the people visiting the beach are worshiping. And so it's very hard for them to tell who's visiting and who's not. The people who go there may be able to tell, but you might not have somebody speak to you and not realize that they're visiting as well. It might be that all the people sitting around him that day were also visitors and they didn't want to speak, you know. So I'm not saying that he didn't have a bad experience. I'm just saying that sometimes it takes a little bit of a couple visits to make sure that that's kind of how it is. But it could be like that even just at West Side when it was just not as many people because that auditorium doesn't flow very well. So it can be hard to get around and speak to people. And so I don't think really people get missed there on a regular basis, but it is possible, I guess, especially a lot of visitors slide in at the very, very beginning of worship and then they slide out as soon as that prayer. It's hard for people to speak to you if that's kind of the way that you approach it. If you're there for Bible class and worship, people have a much better chance of getting you because they're going to get you in between and speak to you. Whereas if you just come for the worship. But it is definitely the case that it's the responsibility of us all to try to make sure that anybody is feeling welcome. And not even just our visitors. I mean, we have people that come, maybe they come only on Sunday mornings and they're never here for anything else. When we have regular classes, maybe they don't come on Wednesdays, they don't come on Sunday nights. How connected do you think that they feel if they're only here for Sunday morning worship? And so they're not visitors, but it's still just as important that we would reach out to them and make sure that they're feeling welcome. And maybe they don't come to some of the other things because they're not quite sure they do feel welcome. You just never know. I mean, it may be a habit that they only come for the Sunday worship, but it might be that they just don't feel like they could come to the Wednesday night Bible class or to the Thursday morning ladies class. I think a lot of times we bring a lot of our past experiences with us. And so when we have an experience with somebody, we project a little bit of what we've experienced other places and things too. So that is something to think of. She said, do you feel confident or eager? Some people feel super confident. They could do any one of these. They could sit in a different spot every single week and be happy with it, speak to every visitor. They could get somebody by the hand and walk them down to the fellowship meal and say, sit right with me. I have known people like that. And you just can't even, you know, they're so friendly and so happy about it that you can't quite tell them no. So then you find yourself sitting maybe where you didn't expect to be sitting. Praying for somebody, right? Most all of us could do that one. Picking up the phone and making that call or dropping that card in the mail, right? Those are things. But some people don't feel confident with anything. Some people have had a lot of things in their past and in their background, we've talked about before, a lot of dysfunctional things, a lot of trauma in people's backgrounds. And so even the one about making that phone call or even just writing that card, that one's hard for them. They're afraid of what that person might say or might think or might do, and they don't trust the response that would be given. And so there are people sitting in our congregations that just couldn't do any of them. And they're not without reason, right? They have a reason behind it, even if they need to kind of maybe think about it a little bit differently. So then she said, if you did do it, how did you feel when you were with that person? Did you feel kind, like you were doing a kindness? Did you feel impatient? Did you feel intolerant of their own struggle if they were having one? Did you feel strong? How were you feeling as you tried to do this thing that you did? And I think her point here is that sometimes if you are a very extroverted person, and you enjoy talking to other people, then you might have a tendency to feel impatient with somebody that is quieter and doesn't care to talk a whole lot in a group. That happens. People do feel that way, and it is something to be mindful of. And likewise, a person who is introverted could be impatient with an extrovert. They think that person is so loud and they are just talking and talking and talking. So we have to be mindful that we are not being impatient with each other on things that are part of our personality, part of our makeup. I think that one thing that I did in a class once, it was a ladies' class, we took a look at the apostles and we talked about their characteristics. Who was bold and fierce, who was a little bit more timid, who was more introverted seeming, who was more extroverted, all of these things. So we went through the gospel accounts, kind of like what Jonathan's been saying on Sunday morning, where we would take a look at the story in all 4 places if it was there, and we would talk about that because the point was that Jesus used them all. He didn't say, well, that one's too introverted, they can't even do this. He still used them. And so the point was, no matter what kind of things you have in your personality, there are some things as a Christian that are non-negotiable, right? Christians cannot go around doing things that are sinful and willfully do it knowing that we are. But then there are other things that are just simply a matter of opinion and personality. There's nothing in my Bible that tells me that you have to be extroverted to go to heaven, and there's nothing in my Bible that tells me you have to be introverted, which tells me that both types of people are good. So we have to keep that in mind, though, because if you are one versus the other, you do tend to feel sometimes impatient, even if you don't realize it. If you really stop to think, then you'll be like, oh, maybe I am a little impatient with that sometimes, and I didn't even know it. So I think that's what she's trying to call our attention to, just to make sure that we are aware of our own perceptions and our own opinions that we're forming as we form them. So on page 82, she says, did you listen to them? If you invite someone and they give you a reason for not coming, were you just waiting for your next point to be able to say, but? Or were you actually hearing what they said? Because again, with Americans, we don't tend to be good listeners. We might be with our very, very close inner circle of people. Maybe you're a much better listener with your spouse and your children, your grandchildren, people like that, than you are with an ordinary person. But a lot of people aren't good listeners at all because they spend a lot of the conversation thinking about what they're going to say next and making sure they have their next comment ready. And so she wants to point out here, we have to be a good listener. If we are doing this thing, then we have to commit to doing it. We have to make sure we're hearing what the other person tells us too. Question 4 that she wanted us to think about, describe what you learned about the recipient that helped you to understand her perspective, who she is, and what she values. If we know something about what a person values, do we know something about a person? Yes. If we know something about what their perspective is on things, do we know something better about a person? Right. And so much of the time, conversation stays to how about that game, which doesn't tell us much of anything other than, hey, that they like football and this is their team. But we don't really know anything about what they value. We don't really know anything about what their perspective is. We don't really know anything about who they are. Now, if they're going to tell you that their favorite coach is their favorite coach because of the way that they're invested in the team, because of how they're able to push the players to be their very best, something like that, then all of a sudden you know something about what they value. So in conversations, do we push a little bit past that initial point? Or do we just let it stay right there? It's something to think about. If we want to really get to know somebody, then we have to know something about them. And to do that, sometimes we have to ask those questions. And we have to also be willing to offer our own information too. Because if you're going to just ask like rapid fire questions at somebody, they're not going to appreciate that very much. But when you have that dialogue that goes back and forth. And so most people in relationships, forming relationships, what is it that you initially talk about? Those things you have in common, right? At work, your very first conversations tend to be about the work. You tend to be talking about, how'd you work on that again? And you know that's always a hassle or whatever it is. And it's the same. I mean, if you are in a group that is getting together and they are sewing, conversation tends to start, who taught you to sew? Do you just sew by hand? These things before they move off into other things. And so sometimes at church, we kind of have a little bit of a disadvantage, right? Because the thing that we have in common is that we are baptized believers. And that's a thing to have in common. That's the very best thing you can have in common because it's the most life impacting. But it also doesn't leave a whole lot to talk about, like some of these other things, like a workplace or like a hobby group, right? If there's a group that gets together because they all love a certain kind of car, then the conversation can just flow back and forth because you can talk about engines and interiors and years and all these things, but we don't really have that. And so we have to start to find other common ground with our Christian family. And you can do it. I've known people that do it by asking Bible questions with people. I literally have the sweetest friend in the world, and one of the things that she always does when she meets people with no shame is she'll say something like, who is your favorite apostle? And they're like, and they answer her because she's caught them so off guard. And she has got a million of those kind of questions. She'll be like, what is your favorite Old Testament book? Who was your favorite prophet? Like just whatever. And she doesn't ask 15 of them at once, but people say things. And it tends to be that they say actually a lot of things to her because they aren't used to being asked questions like that. So they tend to, throw some detail in there. And a lot of times she can have a whole conversation back and forth. And she is amazing because the next thing that I know when I'm watching her, somebody's telling her all about like their family childhood story. And I'm like, how did that even happen? But it's because she has a gift of conversation and she's very good at it. Every time that I went with that friend to a restaurant, every time she would say, we're going to pray before we eat. Is there anything we can pray for you about to the waiter? You will not believe the number of waiters that sat down at our table and said, oh my goodness, this is going on and this and this. And she will write those things down. And she will even sometimes, if it's like a really big thing and the person was, had a spouse with cancer or something, she would go and find the manager and get the address to the restaurant, and she'd be like, I'm going to send a card. And she would send a card to the restaurant. So she wasn't making them feel uncomfortable by getting their home address, but she would follow up with cards. And I was like, this person is just amazing. But that just was who she was, and it's how she did things. And so we can we don't have to do that because maybe that's not how we talk and how we interact. But we can find how we do. The next question she said is, what did you do to show that you valued her? We live in a world where we treat people simultaneously as if they're of great value, but also as if they're worthless at the same time. In the United States, that tends to be how people act. So it's the you can do everything, you're you be you, all of those things that people say, but at the same time, when it comes down to how we actually treat each other, we say all of those things, but then we treat each other in a different way. And that just is. You don't have to look very far in the news media before you can see that that's sort of the attitude that people have. And so we live in a world where there are a lot of people that feel worthless for one reason or another. And if we can show other people that they have value to us, how much easier is it to show them that they have value to God? Because it's hard to imagine that you could have value to the creator of the universe if you can't even see that you have value to somebody sitting right in front of you. And so how do we show other people that we value them? What do we do if we value other people, if we value their time and their...
In the nose.
She was saying when you reach out to them to say something and you accidentally hit them in the nose, we were showing them that we wanted to talk to them. But it's something to think about. We show our value that other people have by how we treat them, right? When we treat others with respect and with courtesy and with kindness and with compassion and care, then we're showing that they have value to us. That just is. It's that simple. And we live in a world that's forgotten a lot of things about good manners. But good manners are how we start to show that we value the people around us. Because when we use good manners, what are we essentially doing? We're saying, I respect you. I'm sensitive to your feelings. I'm aware of how you're feeling. I mean, that's the entire reason that we say please and thank you and you're welcome.
I think we could start with listening.
Yeah.
Really
Yeah,
listen.
Really listening. Yeah, she's saying we have to start with listening. And that's true. And we've talked before about kind of that village component. We don't have that anymore. It used to be that you would have known somebody's grandparents and their parents and them, and you knew their whole family. So if nothing else, you would be like, how's your sister? I know she got married last month, right? Like we knew these things about each other. We don't know these things about each other anymore. So we have to do it in a different way because we don't have that same ability to kind of easily do it the way that people in the past and history have had it. And it used to be people's jobs were very defining. I mean, today people might work somewhere 2 years, go work somewhere else for 5, go work somewhere else for 3 more. And that's fine, right? That's how it works. But before, you learned a trade and you did it for your life. And so people knew if you were the blacksmith, that you were the blacksmith. And they were going to ask you about how your work was going. And now it's hard to ask somebody how their work is going. We're not even sure sometimes, what their work is, much less how it's going. And some people, I think, are at an advantage. If you are something, I have friends who are nurses. And so people will ask them sometimes things like that. If you know your friend is a NICU nurse, then you can say, oh, you're working with the babies every day. Did you get to cuddle one yesterday? Because I hear people do things like that. But for a lot of people's work, we don't even understand what work is. And so it loses us another place where we can be good listeners. So we have to find other ways to be these good listeners. And we can't do it without having the connection. If we don't forge those connections and we don't try to be there, to be present, and to actually interact and communicate back and forth, we're never going to have it, right?
Sometimes when people ask you things, you think they're nosy.
It's true. She says sometimes when people ask us things, we can think they're nosy. There are some things that I think probably shouldn't be asked, right? And we can know that. That's part of where that courtesy comes in. We can think about what would not be an appropriate question maybe to ask, We can think about if our tone sounds judgmental while we're talking about it. Because again, we've used this example before. If you have a teenage girl in your congregation and she's dressing very immodestly, if you have spent her entire life never saying a word to her, and the first thing you ever say to her is, well, that's not a very good dress for wearing to church, then chances are she's not going to take that very well. She is going to think of it as intrusive and nosy because she's going to be like, I didn't even know she knew my name. She's never spoken to me a day in my life. But if that same person is someone that you've been friendly with and you've been talking to for her whole life, and you've asked her, how is school going? How is, if you know she plays soccer, how's your soccer going this year? Those sorts of things. You've built some connection. Then all of a sudden, if you're talking to her about what she's wearing, then it might be received in a very different way. And we have to remember too, I think it's very important, we remember stages, right? People have different stages. Teenagers are not known for responding logically, and they're not known for responding with like great calmness. So if we remember, if we're talking to a teenager, that hey, these responses sometimes happen, then that can help us. And it's the same if we remember. I know that I had somebody tell me once that it was really hard for her because she was going through like the empty nest. Her kids were just all leaving, and it was being very hard for her. Like, she hated it. And everybody kept telling her how lucky she was. Like, you're so lucky. They're out now. You can do whatever you want. And she said that she had to make herself not find that offensive. Because she was like, I don't feel lucky, like it's making me want to cry. And so I just feel like, but she realized that what they were trying to say is, you did such a good job raising them, and now they're living independently. They're doing it. They're so good. And so she said when she chose to look at it that other way, and she actually didn't choose. It was actually her husband that pointed out that she was reacting to it from a different place than how it was meant. Because one day she was really upset and she was slamming car doors and all these things after somebody had said something. He was like, I was right there. And that's not at all what that person meant by that. And sometimes it takes that. It takes a good close friend or a spouse or somebody to point out that maybe you're reacting a little differently than what the person intended. But anyway, if we remember people's stages, then we can try to be more understanding than we are. And we can remember too that even if you've been through something, you haven't been through their something. And so, you have people that will say, I know just what you're going through. Oh, that's a horrible sentence. We should never, ever, ever utter that one. Because even if we've been through what looks on paper like the same situation, it's not the same situation.
Because you were different.
Because you are different people. You have different backgrounds. You have different pasts. You have different everything. And even if everything looked really similar, maybe you had super, super similar backgrounds, the situation itself still was different. And the things that that person did during it, because that's one thing that a lot of people will say when there's like a death. If somebody loses a child or loses a spouse, somebody else who has already lost a child or a spouse, oh, I know just what you're going through. And they mean it as a supportive thing, but it does not sound like a supportive thing. So if we can remember to just mind what we say and how we say it, then all of a sudden, and if we can remember to guard our own reactions too. So if somebody asks us something that maybe does sound like a nosy question, sometimes all it takes is a follow-up. You can even really politely say something like, why do you ask? And they'll tell you. They might tell you why. And sometimes people can take things in a way. I know that when I was expecting our third child, I had somebody tell me, didn't I think I had enough already? Because I already had one boy and one girl, and I was horribly upset with that because I'm like, I'm literally carrying this baby right here, and clearly we are expecting this baby, so it's not a very nice comment to be like, why do you even want this one? But when I talked to that lady a little bit further, it turns out that she just was from a generation where 2 kids is what people had. And she genuinely was like, oh, oh, you're having a third. And I mean, this same lady knows us now that we have 5, and she's, you know, she didn't mean anything by it, is the bottom line. So I had gotten very upset, which not with her. I mean, she didn't know I was upset, but my husband sure did when we left. But it took a second conversation to figure out why she had asked me that. And it was solely because she just grew up in a time where most people just had to and stopped. And so she didn't understand. And she didn't know anybody else that had had, like, you know, more kids or whatever. And so she was just asking about it. So sometimes we have to kind of like push our feelings to the side and be like, maybe my feelings are getting hurt, but they don't mean it that way. And most of the time I would say hurt feelings work that way, right? Sometimes hurt is genuinely inflicted and the person does intend to cause you pain. But I think the vast majority of the time it's unintentional and the person doesn't realize. So if we kind of give each other the benefit of the doubt, if we have those follow-up questions, if we kind of answer things gently, that's why a soft answer turns away wrath. That's always true. So what a lot of people do, though, is then they would be offended by that person forever, and they're going to avoid them, and they're not going to speak to them if they see them in the bathroom, and they're going to roll their eyes and sigh. And that's how a lot of times, especially women, react. And then that can cause a rift in the relationship forever. But it's our job to not let those things happen if we can avoid it. And sometimes it's out of our control, right? A relationship takes 2 people. And it might be that you try to make those overtures of friendship still, and the other person does not. And it might be that the friendship does dissolve. And but to say that you had a part in it isn't good. So as long as we can say, I did do my very best, and then still it went, then that's a different thing than to say that I was contributing to it and I helped it to die as a friendship. And people do that, though, even with their family, right? I mean, there are lots of family members that do that. And if we thought about things a little bit more, and we thought about those, how are we putting our hurt feelings into this? Am I being a good listener? Did I hear what they were saying? And like I said, sometimes there are relationships that do need to be ended. I mean, there can be relationships that are not healthy for the people to be in, and that's not what we're talking about at all. But we're talking about, like, in the church, we have this Christian sister, and she's done something that's offended us, and then we can work back and forth and go through that.
You didn't make my cake.
She said, you didn't make my cake.
I keep forgetting, did you?
So the next question is, did your time together go well? Did both of you interact, or were your efforts unidirectional? Sometimes that can be the case. Maybe the other person's not receptive to you at all. There are some people, and you could try all day long, and you're probably not going to make a lot of headway, a lot of ground. Does that excuse us from trying, though? No. But if we do try and try and try, and they are just not receptive to it, then we can say that we at least did do our part. There are some people that could visit somewhere, and it could be the warmest, most friendly place ever, and they might still find a problem with it. Jonathan and I were talking about that the other day because my boys had doctor's appointments, and so we went to them. And I loved the doctor, and I was like, he was wonderful and so thorough and so, but I know good and well that other moms have taken their child to see this doctor and left saying, I could not stand him, he wasn't listening to us. And so some of it is a matter of how you go into it. What you're expecting to get, you're going to receive, right?
We've heard the same thing about the VA.
Yeah,
They've
yeah.
always been so good to us. But I've heard people really put them down.
People do. Well, she was saying that her husband goes to the VA, and they've had a wonderful experience, and they've been so good to him. But then other people are going to say they're awful, they don't treat us good at all. And so a lot of it does depend upon your way. And I think that to that extent, a lot of times it's about gratitude.
Mm-hmm.
What are you thankful for as you receive it? And again, that's not to say that there could never be a doctor. I'm sure that there's some doctor out there somewhere that isn't very good maybe at their job and isn't caring for their patients as they should. But I think most of the time when somebody says that they really disliked a doctor, it's not founded, right? There are a lot of things in place to make sure people aren't practicing medicine if they shouldn't be. And they're very, very heavily guarded. They really are. And so chances are good, if you've gone to see a doctor, that really he is or she is competent and able to do the treatment. Yes.
My eye doctor, I think it's great, the whole office is great, and somebody from here went, oh no,
Mhm.
I'll never go back. I thought, what are you
Yeah.
talking about?
Yeah.
Couldn't be better in his office, we hugged.
Well, and the good news is if you do have an experience like that, I mean, there are other eye doctors in town, so if somebody really thinks I didn't care for this one, then they can, go to a different one, and that's good. But I think that we should be very careful as Christians about running around town and criticizing some business because of something that they've done, because that is damaging to that business. If you convince 12 people not to go that might otherwise have gone. And that doesn't mean that you couldn't give an honest feedback. I think that you could say something like, I did go and see her one time. I really like him over here better. I think you could say something like that. But I would be careful how much criticism that I heaped onto something, just because your experience might not would be what anybody else's would be anyway. And I just think that things like that, again, it's all that feelings are involved. So if you want to have a doctor that comes in and laughs and tells jokes and these things, because a lot of people like things like that, then that's one thing. But if that's the reason you didn't like that doctor, that's not very fair to him, because he's going to act or she's going to act the way that her personality kind of lends to. And again, that's not to say that if you have, everybody has read of situations where somebody's had their medical license pulled for real wrongs that have been done. So again, not to say that there couldn't be an actual real situation where harm has been inflicted. And then, of course, that's a different story. And it's the same thing with things like teachers. Obviously, we can see real life examples where teachers have done very wrong things. But we would just want to be careful. I know that Jonathan and I, we homeschool our children, but we do try to be careful not to be critical of our public school friends. We don't go around talking about how hideous the school system is, because we don't think that there's any value to be gained in that. We enjoy educational freedom to make the choice that's best for your family. And if that choice that's best for your family is public schooling, then that's wonderful. And we have several family members who are public school teachers, and so we're supportive of that. And but a lot of families might not be. Some people who homeschool or some people who public school are very critical of homeschool and vice versa. And we just try not to do all of that. And so that's another thing to keep in mind with all of this. If we try to see people right where they are. I know I had someone in the church once tell me that she mostly did vote a certain way. And she felt uncomfortable because she felt like a lot of people around her in the church didn't vote that way. And she felt like she was being judged for for the way that she did vote. And so I had asked her one time, because I was actually good friends with this person. So I had asked her, I said, is the way you vote going to keep you out of heaven? And she's like, I don't think so, no. And I said, well, then I probably wouldn't worry about it too much. And I probably wouldn't worry too much about what your people on either side of you in the pew were saying. And I said, well, what have people said to you? And she's like, well, nothing. It's just the way they look at me. And I said, I think, friend, that you might be reading into the situation a little bit. Because I think that, for one thing, there are plenty of people sitting in our pews and nobody has any idea how they voted, because they're not going to sit around and chat politics. And I was like, I think I'd probably just not worry about that too much if I were you. And, she made a conscious effort to try to stop doing that. And she's a lot happier now that she doesn't feel personally attacked constantly, which is how she was feeling. She was letting herself feel that way before. And so I think that sometimes that can happen. And maybe that's the thing. Maybe if there are relationships in the church and you're really good friends with someone, you know that they are having an issue with another person, sometimes you can be that gentle encouragement to that sister that you are closer to. And I've seen that work to great advantage. I don't think that she meant anything by that. And you just leave it. You don't get involved. You're not in there gossiping about things. But you can just give a gentle piece of encouragement. And sometimes that can be a big help. So it's a lot of work. She said, why did your attempt go as it did? If we tried one of these things, and maybe it went horribly, because some of these have the potential to not go very well. If you invite somebody to go to a fellowship event with you and they say they'll come and then they don't, that could have a tendency to hurt your feelings, right? And so you wouldn't call that a success because you did this thing and they told you they'd be there and then they didn't even come, and you feel down and you feel discouraged about it. But then what you have to do, again, it's all about the flipping the positive perspective. Did you do what you should do? And if you did, and then they still didn't come, you can still feel good about that thing that you did. If you genuinely reached out and you genuinely meant good for your sister by inviting her, and then she didn't come, then you just sit with other friends and you just still enjoy the fellowship event. You can't sit around, feeling gloomy through that whole thing just because that person didn't follow through on their part of it. Because again, that can happen a lot of times, right? It can be really discouraging if you've got your congregation's got a VBS and all kinds of people say, oh, I'm bringing my nieces and nephews, I'm bringing my grandkids, and you think you're going to have 35 kids and then you have 10 that day. It could be so discouraging. But if instead you say, 10 are here, let's do this, then that's a much better way to look at it. She said, if you both interacted, how does this experience help you connect? If we interact together, how do we form those connections? When we were at MSOP, they told the wives, many hands make light work. And work is when you get to know each other. So show up and work. Because there was lots and lots and lots of work. Because there were lots of jobs. There were, like for the fellowship meals and for the gospel meetings, there were meals every night for the speaker and for the elders and their families, even if there wasn't necessarily a fellowship meal for everything. And so the wives decorated for those things, and they served the food, they made the food at those things, and they cleaned up after those things. And those things happened year round, so we were constantly needing to do some decorating, some cleaning, some making food, some serving food, just whatever it was. At the lectureship, we did all of the child care for the 5-year-olds and under for everybody who was at the lectureship. So we developed the curriculum, we taught the curriculum, and we had those kids all day long so their parents could go and hear the sessions. And it was during that work that you really got to know other people, because it would take hours and hours and hours to do these things, and that's when you talked. And we had a Valentine's banquet and we had a graduation banquet. So those were two like wedding reception formal events that had lots and lots and lots of time. And those are the times when we got to know each other. And they're like, you cannot sit and be lonely and fuss about not having friendships and simultaneously refuse to come and do your part at those things. Because if you're there, the friendships will be there. They're like, there's just no way around it. There's no way you can sit together for like 4 hours on a Saturday working on this and not talk back and forth at least some. And it was true. We found it to be very true. And so when we work together, we get to know each other. At Westside, they have a Ladies' Day every single year, and they have a committee that plans that Ladies' Day every single year, and the people on that committee are good friends because they have to get together month after month to make sure that one day goes well and to plan it. And so when we do those things together, and not just work, fellowship things too, when we stay for the meals, when we come to the movie nights, when we come to every night of the gospel meeting, Those are the times when we get to know other people. And even if the things we know are little, we build on those things, right? Maybe you notice that somebody gets a slice of chocolate cake every single time, and you realize that, hey, this person likes chocolate. Those are little things that help us to get to know people, and then we can put bigger things layered in on top of it. This congregation is wonderful about putting things on the prayer list, right? In some congregations, the prayer list is non-existent because no one would dare to say, I need prayers right now, or my family member needs prayers right now. And we don't do that here. We have people say, oh, put me down, and this is what's going on. And that's wonderful because that's one way we get to know each other. When we understand what somebody is struggling with or what they're going through in their life, we have people in this congregation, I think, that are wonderful to kids, right? Because in a lot of congregations, kids are virtually ignored except for by their actual teachers down in the classroom. Nobody speaks to them and hugs them and things, and that's not the case here. Everybody wants to talk to them, and everybody treasures them, and they know that they have value, and they know that they matter in the congregation. And I think in a lot of congregations, young people do not know that. And so we can think about these things as we're going through about our efforts, because that's what the point is. The point is to make these people feel valued, to make every person in our congregation, from our cradle roll all the way to our most senior member, everybody should feel their value. And they can't do it if all of us aren't doing our job. And so we have to make sure that we're valuing like all the level of people that there are. That is my 5-minute warning. So I totally lied to y'all because I said we were going to get through it. We are going to get through this chapter. I'm going to push ahead just a little faster, and we will start with the next chapter the next time. She said, was there an indication that the recipient feels supported or encouraged? Do you feel encouraged? Now, ideally, when we're encouraging someone else, we would feel encouragement ourselves. And when someone else encourages us, then they should feel encouragement. But sometimes encouragement can even be one-sided. We might encourage somebody else and not feel encouraged ourselves. Did the other person or couple reach out to you in return? That is a unique phenomenon that's going to happen with this thing. Sometimes we will find if we've reached our hand out to somebody, that all of a sudden they're going to reach back. They're going to have things that they come back to you and say and ask. And sometimes it's the case that the person just didn't know. If there's like a fellowship meal, somebody who is single and doesn't have a spouse, doesn't have children, maybe they just really don't think that that's for them. And they wonder like, oh, where would I sit when I went down there? And once you invite them and they come down and stay, then they know. Like they know that they could be there too. She said, if you are feeling more patient, more tolerant, more understanding, why do you think that is? So if we practice patience, what are we going to develop more of? Patience. And if we practice understanding, we're going to develop more understanding. And sometimes it's easier said than done. Most people find that their patience is sort of stratified. You might be extraordinarily patient in these circumstances. It's starting to slip a little here, but then you're super impatient with these sorts of things. Most people are not all the way patient or all the way impatient. They have areas where they succeed very well and areas where they don't. I can't really think of anyone that I know of that's not ever impatient with something, right? I think that's kind of human nature to get impatient with things. I might think of somebody as an extremely patient person, but if I really thought about it, I could think of something that kind of pushed their buttons a little and made them feel a little impatient, even if they have excellent self-control and they don't act on their impatience. Because I think that is the case. You know, some people can feel impatient but still act patient. Right? That's kind of the hallmark of a good elementary school teacher, to be able to do that, or even of a nurse, lots of professions where they need to be able to maybe feel a little impatient with someone, but continue to act patiently. And so the point is, though, when we do that on a regular basis, then we develop more patience, we develop more understanding, we develop more tolerance toward other people. And so we can think of all of those things. And she says on page 84, she says to pray about it, to pray about that person, to pray about that situation. And I really liked how she ended this. So I'm just gonna, for the closing of this, I'm just gonna read page 84 to 85. I visited a congregation on a Wednesday night. I came in through a side door and began looking for a classroom directory. A couple behind me got my attention. "We don't know you. Are you new here?" I told them it was my first visit and that I was looking for an appropriate classroom. When we introduced ourselves, I was delighted to know I was speaking with Stan and Nell, and that Stan was an elder in the congregation. So Nell told me it was singing night. Almost everyone would be in the auditorium. After learning I was a soprano, she introduced me to 3 women who made a place for me on their pew. She welcomed me again and invited me to come again. The 3 women asked me about myself. They told me a bit about themselves. After the song fest, these women and others sitting around us invited me to come again. We chatted for 20 minutes. No one was in a hurry to get away and get back to their own lives. My next visit was on Sunday morning. As I entered the auditorium, at least 5 people stopped me and introduced themselves. One woman took me by the arm and invited me to sit down with her. On each of my first half-dozen visits, someone offered me a seat. One person gave me her phone number and invited me to call her that week. There is no way a person can feel invisible with that kind of attention. Attendance there runs just under 500. I have worshiped in many loving, supportive congregations, but I have never had so many who made me feel significant just because I exist. They didn't wait to find out if I was important or useful before they treated me so. I was important simply because I was there. The way those Christians behaved had nothing to do with me. It was about Christ living in them and their service to God. How can you not want to be with people like that all the time? How can you not want to be loving and giving in return? This is why we are spending time thinking about how to draw others in, because we want all to find a place and purpose in the body of Christ. So we have a lot of people in the world that feel invisible. They don't feel like they're seen by the people around them, or even worse, I think they sometimes feel like they are seen and they aren't wanted. That's even just a little bit worse than feeling invisible. But I think if you were in any given room, a good chunk of your room feels one of those 2 things. And we can make it not so. Because if only one person feels like that person has value and importance, that still matters. If you've lived your whole life thinking that no one does, and then all of a sudden there's one person investing themselves in you, then that is a big, noticeable difference. And it can make all the difference in the world. And so we have to be sure that's what the Bind Us Together means. We have to be sure that we're trying to make that difference in other people's lives. So thank you, ladies, for joining us. I was going to say next week and the week after, I think we'll have class both of those weeks, but then we'll take a Christmas break. So we will meet next week, and we will meet that week after, but then we won't meet for those weeks until after New Year's, which I think that's January 6th we come back. So I think it's 3 weeks in all that we'll take off. The week before Christmas, the week of Christmas, and then that week of New Year's we'll take off. But just so everybody's aware that that's upcoming. All right, see you all next week.
Over all the earth, you reign on high, every mountain stream, every sunset sky. But my one request, Lord, my only aim, is that you'd reign in me again. Lord, reign in me, reign in your power, over all my dreams. In my darkest hour, you are the Lord of all I am. So won't you reign in me again? Over every thought, over every word, life reflect the beauty of my Lord, 'cause you mean more to me than any earthly thing. So won't you reign in me again, Lord, reign in me, reign in your power over all my dreams. In my darkest hour, you are the Lord of all I am. So won't you reign in me again, Lord, reign in me, reign in your power over all my dreams. In my darkest hour, you are the Lord of all I am. So won't you reign in me again, you are the Lord of all I am. So won't you reign in me again?